going to talk to you about the Ecopoxy today and go through some of the tips and tricks that I use to get the best pours out of my epoxy. Some of the things that people try to avoid are the bubbles, because they come out of the material that you're pouring on, and your actual reaction between the resin and the hardener of a two-part epoxy system. What I use is Ecopoxy resins. The UVPoxy is what we're going to be using today. They also have a couple other products. The liquid plastic, which is more of your casting resin, really thick pores, and a multi-surface sealer, which is more for sealing porous objects and whatnot. But more specifically, we're going to be talking about the UVPoxy today. I'd like to cover off some of the housekeeping items before you even get into your epoxy resin pour. First of all, a good set of gloves are important. Although UVPoxy, all the Ecopoxy brand epoxies are natural. They're made from natural products like soybeans and flax oil and cashew oils. So you could get it on your hands and it wouldn't be that much of a problem, but you probably don't want to. So what I keep handy is some isopropyl alcohol and some shop towels. So you can get the isopropyl alcohol is what cuts the resin, and you can clean whatever tools off with it quite easily, and get it off your gloves if you need to clean things off. What I'll do is have pre-pour containers that are marked resin and hardener, and I'll have my sticks for pouring those specific parts of the two-part system. And then I'll have my main pot. So what I've got also is a heat gun, and a lot of people used to use blow torches or whatnot, and although it's cool to use that, the temperature isn't exact, and it's one thing that you really want to tackle and have control of when you're working with your epoxies. It is a temperature thing. When the two parts are mixed together, it's an exothermic reaction. If it heats up too much, your pot's going to go hard. I haven't really had that problem with any of the Ecopoxy system, but I've worked with other resins in the past, and I've heated up the pot too much, and it literally hardened within 30 seconds. So you just want to be careful that you're not heating it up too much. Whereas, like with the heat gun, it's a lot easier to control that temperature. I usually set it around 350, and it seems to be the right heat. I'll use it to heat the resin as I pour sometimes. I'll also use it to pop the bubbles if there are any that need to escape the surface as you're pouring. One thing that you want to make sure is that you get your piece, whatever you're pouring, set up. Make sure that it's level. I've made sure that it's level, and then we're almost ready to go. One of the things with the UVPoxy that I've found is that the resin is really thick, so to get it to the same consistency as the hardener, it's a good idea to actually put it in a hot to warm bath, the actual bottle of resin into a warm bath, and get that resin flowing a little bit better than what it might flow coming out of just your cold storage or whatever. So it's been soaking for quite a while. I'll just take that out, and I will pour it into my pre-mix container, and hopefully this is flowing really well. And it is flowing really well. The nice thing about these containers that I use, they're food safe. It's not really something that I really need for this resin, but they're marked with like these are 4-ounce containers, so I know that I'm getting a right one-to-one mix when I pour them into these pre-mixed containers that I have. And they're clear containers, so I can put them beside each other and make sure that I've got a one-to-one mixture. Now, if you're just getting into using these this resin, I would recommend going one-to-one. It's the standard mix, but I've got it on good authority that you can actually mix more resin into it and play with the ratios up to about 2-to-1 resin to hardener, and you'll get different active pot times, different hardness levels, as well as different cure times. So it really depends on your specific scenario, what you're pouring. Once you get really good at it, you'll know what ratios you want to use. It also depends seasonally what your humidity is like, the temperature in your shop or what have you, right? So, with that said, I've got my resin and my hardener ready to pour. What I'll normally do is actually pour the hardener in first. I don't think there's a specific way to do this, right or wrong, but since the hardener usually flows better than the resin does, I like to put the hardener in the pot first. Just so that there isn't, if my resin is thick, that there isn't thick resin sitting at the bottom of my pot that may or may not mix as well as I'd like it to. So that's my hardener premix pot and my hardener stick, and I'll switch to my resin stick, and I'll pour my resin in, get it all in there. And if it's like summertime and it's warm in the shop, I may or may not pre-warm my resin, but it still will be thick. So what I'll do is I'll turn my heat gun on, and it's got a digital gauge on it, so I know when it's up to 350. And I'll actually, as I'm pouring the resin in, sometimes I'll heat my premix cup here, and you might not be able to see it, but it starts to flow really quite good, and it also kind of burns the fingers. But she's in there now, and I have a separate stick for mixing my active pot. So you're supposed to mix this for 3 to 5 minutes. What I like to do is really get in there, scrape the sides, make sure that my mix is together. You'll see that it's actually, once you get the hardener and the resin together, it goes milky, somewhat milky. So you know that you can actually see how well it's mixing. You'll get a good feel for it. You make sure that you scrape the sides to get all that resin and hardener mixed well together. What I like to do is, instead of vigorously mixing it up, I like to fold it. And that's one of my, no one's really told me to do this, but it just makes sense that folding it will reduce the amount of air that I'm mixing into the mix, and hopefully reduce the amount of bubbles that I have. Now you don't want to pour this right away, right after you mixed. One of the secrets to getting a really clear pour is to let it sit, let it heat up, get that exothermic reaction going. The bubbles will come to the surface, and you can take your trusty heat gun and pop those bubbles before you even start your pour. Should be quite clear at that point. So I'll continue mixing this for a little bit, and I'll come back and show you a few more tips in terms of getting your clear pour. Okay, we're back now. The resin's been sitting here heating up. The bubbles have started to come to the surface. And we'll get this stuff out of the way so we can see a little bit better. The mixture is pretty clear. There's some pretty fine bubbles coming up. So what I'll do is get that heat gun going again. And pop some of those surface bubbles. Make sure that resin's going to be flowing nicely. It doesn't take much to pop the bubbles when the mixture, the pot, is still warm and heating up a bit. So there's one tip that I picked up the other day. There's a older guy that lives across from me that they make custom prosthetics at a lab here in town, and he gave me this one little tip. He said, have 2 pots going and pour into that second pot down to a pencil tip pour, and you'll actually get even more of those bubbles out as you're pouring. You may have a little bit of loss in terms of some of your resin that is left in the original pot, but there's nothing saying that you can't heat her up a little bit more and get that remaining resin out of that pot. As you can see, it's flowing pretty good. Now the reason why we wanted to make sure that our piece is nice and level is that obviously the cure time for resins are pretty long. It can be dry to touch within 8 to 12 hours quite easily, maybe even less than that. Your full cure is probably 24 to 48. Alright, we're into our second pot. There's still some bubbles that are coming up to the surface. Pop those guys a little bit more. This is about my 3rd heat gun that I've gone through because I just use it and use it and use it. So now we've got a really clear resin mixture, and we're going to just start pouring. This is an art piece that I've been commissioned to make from the old pieces of the bench from our old stadium. What I do with these art pieces is I'll actually set them up as a shadow box. So I've got this trough all the way around, so I have no worries about over pour. As I'm pouring the resin, it'll settle into all the low places and fill them up. I've got the back, any kind of voids or cracks taped off with green tape, painter's tape. Seems to work fairly well. I've used tuck tape as well for certain projects if I want that really good seal on fairly uneven surfaces. So yeah, I'm just going to start pouring through here, and we'll see how it flows. I should get a very clear pour. I'm going to go ahead and mix a few larger pots and get this whole thing poured, and then we'll come back and talk about how I pop more of these bubbles. Now I have to move to a bigger pot for my next pour. And another thing, if you're doing a lot of resin pours with bigger pots, and you don't want to play that waiting game and babysit bubbles, you can get something like a vacuum chamber and a vacuum pump. Fairly inexpensive to set this up. We've got a couple valves on here, and make sure that this one's open and that one's closed, the relief valve. And all you have to do is, my pot is in there already. Put the pot in, put the lid on top, make sure everything's sealed up, and throw your vacuum pump on. Make sure you get it up to whatever pressure you think works in your particular scenario, and it'll start to suck all those bubbles right up out of your resin pot. Let that sit a little bit and see that all those bubbles come up to the surface, and then open up your relief valve. Relieve that pressure. Much of that air will flow back into the vacuum chamber, and what you come out with is really clear resin. And I want to make sure that my heat is going. My heat gun is up temperature again. Make sure my pot is nice and going to be flowing and nice and warm. Pop some of those remnant surface bubbles, and then get to pouring again. I could have done this with a much larger pot, and I don't know, I just like to be, I don't have any problems with it. I have an open pot time on all this stuff, and I can control the temperature and make sure that things are flowing. I don't mind taking a little bit of time to mix subsequent pots to continue with my pour. It's you got a little bit more control that way, I guess. It's just the way that I like to do it. And you're playing a waiting game normally with these pieces, and you're usually babysitting bubbles, and standing here, it's kind of like watching paint dry. It's kind of like watching bubbles pop in epoxy. You're going to stand here with your heat gun, you see some bubbles come to the surface, and you'll want to pop them. It doesn't take much effort at all to pop those bubbles. Just got a fairly clear pour. More and more of those bubbles will come to the surface, so it just gives you time to mix another pot if you need more epoxy. This way, I mean, I'm pretty well avoid wasting too much of my epoxy as well by doing this, so it works for me. Okay, now that my pour is complete, it's just a matter of doing a little bit of babysitting and popping any of those bubbles that raise to the surface, mainly from the material now. It's just some of the air pockets that were trapped in there. The epoxy resin is clear as glass. And again, this UVPoxy that is from Ecopoxy is the clearest resin that I've ever worked with. It's crystal clear, UV resistant, won't fade. There's little to no shrinkage as it's curing, because they don't use fillers. So it's super versatile, and you'll notice that you know, as a testament to the fact that it's safe and has low odor. I don't use any kind of respirator or anything. It's nice and safe. It's a really beautiful product. So you can purchase Ecopoxy on my site, woodworkfinishes.com, and I'll put that link in the show notes, as well as if you want any other information, feel free to search for Ecopoxy online. They've got a website, they've got some pretty good YouTube videos out there, and I hope this helped you maybe tackle some of those problems that you've encountered when pouring any kind of epoxy, for that matter. Yeah, take care and happy resining.